All right. We are live, and I'm having a lot of fun with this series because I am getting a chance to catch up with people that I first met quite a while ago. And I think I may have sent you this picture. If not, I will follow up with it. But I have a photo in my Flickr account from circa 2006,
Okay, enough said.
and
Yeah.
it is at Adam Quirk's rooftop.
I
I think it was on Atlantic Avenue. I was sort of in that general in Brooklyn, and it was sort of a tech friends gathering, barbecue on a Brooklyn rooftop. And I think it was the first time I met you. I feel like I drove over there. Did I like give you a ride
Yes,
home or something?
yes. We had, I think, met through Union Square Ventures, perhaps, but yes, and you gave me a ride over there, I believe, and also recall having to climb a metal ladder that was, like,
Yeah.
attached to a brick wall in order to get up onto the roof, and as
Yes.
who had 2 young toddlers at the time, I was questioning my decision making.
Yeah, there was no foam rubber bottom. This was like old school Gen X playground metal. If you fall, you're gonna get hurt. Yeah, I totally remember that ladder going up the roof. But the other thing, and we'll get into the entrepreneurship side that always reminds me of you, and you probably know what I'm gonna say is we had talked early about a few startup ideas that you had early on, and we talked through a pre Food 52 idea that ultimately you pivoted away from. And it was while I was working on a startup. And so, you sort of joke around about being ramen profitable, but we wound up getting some almond cake revenue because you in appreciation for some of the advice and talking through some of your early startup ideas, baked Alex Lyons and I the best almond cake I've ever had in my life. So good that I asked you for the recipe. And for years, like my mom would make it for our holidays, complaining all the whole time about how expensive almond paste was and the cost of making this cake. And then I picked up on it and I have made it numerous times since then as
Oh,
well. And so every
that's nice to
every
hear.
holiday, we wound up making the almond cake and it was absolutely terrific. But OG New York tech stuff is not necessarily what we came here to talk about. You built a company called Food52, had a private equity majority transaction after running it for a number of years. Just to start off, tell everyone, for those who are not familiar, your background and how that led into what was Food52. So let's just kind of start there.
Yeah. I started cooking in college. I cooked in Europe after college, and then I got hired as a food reporter at the New York Times, where I spent the first 7 years of my career as a writer, feature writer, and then an editor at the magazine. And I'd written a couple of books. And so I was very much, immersed in food media, food world.
And
How that led into Food 52 was that, well, there was a little bit of a detour, but actually, I think it was an incredibly productive detour, which was that I found myself having a lot of ideas while I was at the New York Times. I was just always entrepreneurial, and I was always trying to get them to like start new things and launch new things. And it just wasn't a place that was really looking to innovate at the time. That has changed, obviously. And I was getting kind of frustrated. And so I actually left the Times to start a tech startup. And I just, I think sometimes I think I'm a person who jumps into the deep end and figures out how to swim. I've always been that way, so it wasn't that scary to me to do that. But I realized over the course of a year that while the idea that I had, I think, was solid, we weren't the team to execute it. I had two technical co-founders. It was just a very big idea, and we ended up kind of carving off a small chunk, getting an app launched and learning a lot, but I didn't feel like there was a business there. However, that experience, having kind of jumped into the New York startup culture, which at the time was really quite small and very collegial, and that's obviously how we met. And I learned that, oh, these are my people. These are people who have ideas, they want to make them happen, they will do everything they can to make them happen, and I'm one of those people. And so even though this idea didn't fly, this first idea, I knew that this was the place I wanted to spend the next phase of my career. And so I had, some observations about what was happening in the food world and felt like that was the genesis of Food 52. So I got that started. And I was able to use what I learned in that first year, like, because you're constantly learning. In the startup world, you may learn by making mistakes generally.
Yeah, for sure. I'm quite curious if you had started the way you started today. I wonder whether instead of seeking out technical co-founders, you might have found yourself on a vibe coding app or something to like you had this idea and the time that you can go from I have an idea to let me put it in front of somebody. Like
Hmm.
you literally start today and have an idea by Monday that you can put in front of somebody. And whether or not the learnings came from the time it took to get users in front of it, like had you vibe coded your initial idea over a couple of weeks, could you have shortened that first year's worth of learnings in that time? Like it was just about the product iteration, or were there other lessons that like were more human lessons, just talking to knowledgeable people that just still would have taken the similar amount of time that just needed a year or a longer amount of time to really get sunken in?
I would say almost entirely the latter, that it was really the big lessons I learned were about how the startup industry worked, how companies got off the ground, how they got investment, what did the landscape look like, who were
Mhm.
the players, all of that. So, and would I have needed an entire year for that? Maybe not, but it definitely helped to have time to start building relationships and, understanding where I wanted to play.
Gotcha. And if only at the time there was a book that you could, as an early fundraiser, that you could have read that would also help shortcut your time in that space. But I mean, it is fairly interesting to think back to like all of that, you know, getting investors, how to get off the ground and all of this sort of stuff. The amount of information. Now there's the opposite problem. Now there's like too much information that is often conflicting and confusing. But all of that, especially in New York at that time, had to be learned for the first time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I was, yes, I was coming from a very different field, obviously. And yeah, so it was great. I mean, at the end of the year, it was a little scary because, of course, I realized, well, wait, this first thing is not working. Now, what am I going to do? And I've left my like cushy media job, which was cushy then. And, I had to figure things out.
So I'm also curious about the transition from somebody out there pitching, getting investor dollars, feeling like a sort of scrappy founder to whether at some point the like, I'm running a company now. I'm not just out there with a PowerPoint deck and a demo, but this starts to feel like a business and the challenge changes. Was there a point at which it started to shift and what it demanded of you shifted? That you're like, oh, this is now real. I'm now running something. Or maybe that happened as soon as the first investment that you gathered closed.
Well, I'll tell you two stories that I think relate very much to this. One is that we had 20 employees before my mom stopped calling it my project. And so I think that I say telling that story because I think it signals to like what is ingrained in me, which is that, you know, to me, it wasn't like I wasn't going to be saying in fact, it took me a really long time to call myself a CEO because I was like, CEOs run companies with thousands of people. And honestly, I kind of think that the whole use of chief whatevers is just kind of silly. I'm just not a titles person. Like I didn't even really know what my title was at the New York Times for years, and I didn't care because I just was focused on what I was doing. And so, I can think I was sort of skeptical. Like I'll call myself a chief executive officer when I feel like this is a real business. And I think there's a lot of years, at least, for a company to feel like, okay, we've figured out what our product is, who our market is, and how we're going to reach those people. And so I think the other story I wanted to tell you is that when we were raising our first, not our was it our seed round? I guess it was our seed round. And
All the nomenclature has changed since then, but
sorry, our first A round, I guess. So it was, and Bertelsmann Digital Media Investments was coming in, and Sam Blaustein was the lead, and he said, "Amanda, you really have to stop using your personal email. Like, you need a Food52 email." And to me, it was like, well, like, that seemed like such a formality that was to me, it was like, it was window dressing. Same with CEO. It's window dressing. I'm much more of a, like, I'm gonna show you, not tell you. And so that's I guess when I guess it took me a long time to really, it wasn't that I didn't feel like what I was doing was real or important, that it was definitely the most, like, highest priority thing for that I was focused on. And the only thing I was really focused on, and outside of my family. And but I just was like, I wasn't interested in building, like, what I felt like was a fake company, one that was just raising money and trying to sell, like, raising money, building as fast as they could to sell. I wanted to build a company for the long term.
given that you brought it up, the idea of this is the most important thing outside of my family is something that I have thought a lot about over the past couple years. And one of the reasons that I stopped investing out of my funds is because I felt like the what it demanded of being a very good first check investor, somebody who is Johnny on the spot to all the new things. I mean, we're in the middle of Tech Week here in New York, and there's literally 80 million events that one could go to if you were a VC, sort of directly conflicted with how I wanted to show up for family. And usually people at my stage do one of two things. They either start to go later stage, meaning they don't have to be the first check into everything. They can sort of wait until somebody gets $1 million of revenue, or they build a team where I go hire the 27-year-old that I used to be going to all of the events and stuff like that. And then they can sort of bring it to me as a partner. I think there's an interesting question around entrepreneurship now, because especially with AI, you can automate a lot of things, and there are a lot of services available for you to hand off some of the aspects of running a business. But oftentimes people just work the same amount and they just, accomplish more, and the bar is raised. And so it doesn't actually save them any time. I'm curious, as you built the company, how you thought about how you did your best work, the timing of it, those delineations between personal time and work time, and whether, balance as a founder is a cliche or something that you were just like, no, I worked better when I had this balance, and how you drew lines around.
Well, I would say, tackle the first piece, which is the kind of balancing things at the business itself. And I think
Mhm.
mistake that my co-founder and I think we made was that as the business needs, so our business was a media and commerce business. And we, as founders, were a presence on our media, on the site and in all of our channels. We were not looking to be influencer celebrity types. It was simply, we were community based, and we wanted people to know that there were, like, real people behind it, and there was this consistent thread, and we were there to, kind of propagate that thread. So as the business got busier and there were more demands internally, and it was kind of like, the sort of, you need to be having one-on-ones all the time, every week, blah blah blah, it really pulled us away from the external. And I actually think that long term hurt the company. And so I would say, and it took us a really long time to hire an assistant, for instance. And that, so I think there are things that I would just do differently, where I would communicate, so I feel like there's a balance inside the company, how you spend your time.
Yeah.
And I think actually this is the thing that I think founders struggle with the most, as far as I've seen and heard from my kind of, group of founder friends, is that just balancing your time with the business, like, because those demands shift all the time. And so you're constantly having to shift the way you do things. But of course, it's human nature to kind of, like, want to put a system in place and, like, rinse and repeat. And so it's hard, so, you're kind of looking for some stability, I would say, somewhere. And so, how you schedule your time is often a place that you want it to be, to have some stability. So I would say that's probably where I struggled the most. And to me, the balance of family and company, like, I think it was, I was lucky in that I was dealing with a subject matter that involved home and cooking, and so, when we had
You could be
pop-ups.
home.
Yeah, no, I could, but actually we didn't
Mhm.
do that so much because also my kids were, like, little, so I didn't actually wanna be, like it was hard to work at home, so I
Yeah.
actually it was the opposite. But, like, my kids, like, would greet people at the door at our pop-ups, it was, I put them to work. It was a little bit of, like, a family affair. When you're building a company, it kind of is a whole family effort, and so in a
Mhm.
way, I think it kind of was a family bonding to because yeah, there's one partner in the among the parents who is very consumed in their work. And so it is, I don't think, like, I never felt like, I mean, yes, there are definitely things that I missed with my kids, but I have lots of friends who work in corporate America who have the same
Who
situation
also do
because,
the same thing.
but when you are running something you started, it's a real privilege, right? So, like, I never felt like, I felt like I was lucky.
Yeah, for sure. And I also think there's sort of an intentionality that as a CEO that you can carve out and say, listen, this is a time that I'm going to be busy. This is a time that I'm, here's when we have meetings and all of this sort of stuff. And we can not everything's within our control, but we, to your point, often have a lot more flexibility than someone who works in a corporate environment and
Yeah.
you have however many bosses and all of this sort of stuff. So you brought up your founder friends, and I think this is something that I think a lot of people it doesn't get talked about a ton, but every successful founder that I've talked to says that they had a circle of people that they could bounce things off of, sort of, maybe it comes in a cohort. How did you make and use founder friends? And what was your, how did you find your tribe of other founders and what kinds of things would you use them for and support each other for?
Sure. Well, co-working spaces, which were a thing. We worked at our first office was Dog Patch. I don't, if you remember
Oh,
Dog
yeah.
Labs, and got invited there. Okay, so it was a
John
6 month.
Steinberg ran, who then built his own media business
Yeah,
after
that's
that.
right. Yeah, and it was a 6-month gig, and it was great because we were immediately immersed among, 8 companies, of varying sizes, and there was lots of events, and, so there was a lot of socializing. Also, I do think that it probably was easier at the time that we were getting started because the community of New York startups was so much smaller, and so there were dedicated events that, like, literally everyone would go to. And so it was very easy to quickly kind of meet people who I think, the challenge I think for me, and my co-founder Meryl was simply that we were not a super techie startup at all, right? We were building a media platform and a commerce platform, and so we were a little bit on, like, outsiders. We were early for, like, the lifestyle startups among the
Right.
lifestyle startups. And so I would say that, people were always very nice, but it wasn't like, I think there was a little bit of a, certainly among some founders, and I think this is understandable when you're trying to move fast and, like, you need people who are really gonna help you, that I think maybe we were seen as people who couldn't nearly, like, they could help us, but we couldn't help them. And so, in a way, it was a good filter because a lot of the people who I connected with, it was not just a transactional relationship, it was a real friendship. But the other thing I will say is that one of our investors had an amazing list serve, and it was functioning until I think very recently, where no investors were on it. It was only their founders, and it was the most transparent thing I've ever been on. People just would ask really, like dumb questions. Or they would say, like, "Hey, I'm having trouble with this, like, email service. Like, who else is?" And people were really candid and just by email. And that was, like, super helpful. And I met a lot of people through it. And then additionally, like, BDMI would do a founders only session at their annual summit. And so, like, they did things that really encouraged partnership among the founders. So,
Oh,
maybe it was
yeah.
timing, but, I think just, like, naturally, like, most founders are, like, natural networkers because you have to be.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, Dogpatch is where I first met Ben McKean for the first time from Hungry Root, actually, and through an SLP event that they were in his previous company. And so it's one of those things that it was a point in time that place existed, but the ripple effects of, its impact in the community really, really lasted.
Yeah.
What so, yeah, I'm gonna ask you a question about, and I know you have a new West Coast adventure now happening in your life,
Yeah.
and I'm curious, one of my limited partners started a business that had a successful exit, and he said to me, "I'm really struggling. I think I would like to do something again, but my bar is kind of all messed up because I know too much now. And if I now that I realize how hard it is, if I would have went back in time, I never would have started my business because it was sort of a crazy idea and it actually worked. But now my bar is too high for starting something new. And I think you kind of need a little bit of, sometimes as a founder, you need a little naivete because you kind of know all the reasons why something might be too hard or not work. And I'm curious for anybody out there who has had a successful outcome, how you would think about potentially being a second, like a next act, and whether or not, if you were to start something again, the ways in which you'd feel well positioned, and then are there ways in which you'd feel like maybe you know too much and you'd be a little jaded because you got to see how hard it was?
I don't I I guess I don't know if what this other your founder friend like says, like, it doesn't resonate with me, honestly. It is, these are very personal things, right? And I know that I love building things.
Hmm.
There are a lot of things that I would do differently. I think any founder is going to feel that way, whether they've had a successful exit or not. You know, you're kind of constantly building this reservoir of things that you've learned. But I'm not afraid. I understand that maybe because the first thing I did fail, and so I know that that can happen again. I do feel like I believe in subject matter expertise,
Hmm.
especially in field or my sort of genre of fields, and so I know it was not something that people talked a lot about when we were first raising money. In fact, it was sort of shrugged off. But I think that, proven that it mattered and it made a difference because there were certainly like technical founders who were in the food space who raised so much more money than we did, and almost none of them succeeded. And I really do think that a lot of that was because of the lack of subject matter expertise. And so that's my bias, of course, but
Yeah.
so I guess I'm willing to fail again, but I also think I would yes, I certainly do feel like the naivete helps, but I also think some things you've learned can also really can get you like either a faster start or a cleaner start. Because I think kind of once you're in it, you're just, you're kind of having to sort through the muck and find your way, no matter how much experience you've had.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Tell me a little bit about what you learned about what's important in a co-founder relationship. You had a very long-lasting co-founder relationship, and many times, these you learn sometimes quickly, sometimes a long time that the relationship isn't as much as a fit. You start a company with a friend, the needs of the company change. What made your relationship work, and what would you advise people to seek out in a co-founder?
Yeah. Above all, trust and respect. Those are the two things that they will trump everything else. Like, people are often talk about, skills, complementary skill sets. And I mean, yes, of course that can be helpful, but then you're basically kind of like hiring each other. And it's more of a marriage than it is anything else. And because it's very, when you start a company, there's an emotional core, putting yourself on the line. You're often putting your bank account on the line and your financial security, that's your family's financial security. That's, all of these very really bigger things than like who knows how to, create a spreadsheet. And on paper, I could see how an investor looked at Merrill and me and they're like, you guys have matching skill sets, and you're lacking X, Y, and Z, critical skill sets. But I actually think it was like the fact that we trusted each other and had great respect for each other and understood each other meant that we could like fluidly, shift. Like, there were times when I managed our, tech and finance teams, and there were times that Meryl did. And there were times that she, ran the editorial team, and there were times that I did. And we both came from, editorial backgrounds. And that just comes from, that trust and respect. And I think that's how, and having that really strong relationship, like, we resigned from our board the past December in unison. I mean, that's how it was. It was a really long relationship. And I wouldn't have wanted to do it any other way because it felt like we started the company together. Let's end our relationship with the company together.
That's it's really fantastic. Last question I have is about investors. And what did it mean to you to take on outside capital, to have a board member? And, if somebody came to you and said, I have this thing, I'm not sure if I really need outside capital, or I could take something from sort of family and friends to get me up and running, but I also have, money that I could take from a professional investor, but they're going to ask for a board seat. They want all this sort of stuff. I'm a little hesitant about that. What would your advice, based on your experience, be for taking on professional investment, and sort of how it changes things, or how it helps, or the additional responsibility it takes for having that kind of outside capital?
Well, I think it comes down to, if you take on a professional investor, you are saying you're planning on exiting the company. You're going to sell the company. You're going to grow it and sell it. And I'm not sure that everyone goes into that relationship fully understanding that and knowing what that means. Like that ultimately you're going to make decisions that lead to that, whether they're like incremental small decisions or bigger decisions. And that maybe the idealism of what you were trying to build gets shifted a bit, and no matter what. And I think understanding that like when you make that decision to take on that investment, that is part of the that like that you're accepting that. And so whether or not there's a board member, I think is in a way like less important. I mean, if you're afraid of having a board member, somebody that is investing in your company as a board member, like they shouldn't be an investor then. You shouldn't accept them as an investor because I feel like it, yes, there are technical control issues, right, with who's the decider, but uh, outside of that, like ideally, any investor you'd welcome on your board, right, because you want them to be additive, and they're coming with a different perspective, or they've seen something that you haven't, they have access to more information than you do, and so I skepticism around them. Although I have a friend who's raised a ton. I mean, tens of millions of dollars for a company and has no board. And I'm just like, wow, impressive. I mean, I understand from the perspective of like it simplifies matters to like just be able to like have their trust and go and build the company without having to kind of manage a board. But I also think that if you are going to have investors, ideally you have investors who are great to have on a board. I've largely really appreciated our board members.
Gotcha. No, it's when it works out, it's really helpful. And I think one of the things I also advise founders too is to be intentional about what you want from them. Right. I think too often, and this is
Yeah.
a mistake that I would fail. I feel like make in the past, where I would join a board or join as an observer, and I just immediately get right into asking all sorts of questions and getting all up in somebody's business, and not really having an established sort of, I would like to be helpful. Here's how I generally find that I can be helpful. It's by like actually understanding what's going on in the business. Like, here's what I need to do that. Like, our shared goal should be for you to get as much help as possible and for me to be as helpful as possible. And like, here's the way we do that. And like, sometimes that's sort of skipped over, and we
Yeah.
kind of go right to like, "Oh, you needed the money. The term sheet indicated that these were your board members. So I guess you're stuck with these people now." And there's no like, how are we doing this? It just goes straight into like governance and management of a board members. And the what it can do for you is like never really outlined. So I think everybody should be really intentional about
Yeah. And I think, if you can bootstrap until you're like really sure that you need investment, you'll do a better job of raising that money, but also the money will be better spent.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
I mean, you know this, but Meryl and I were never the like raise money, then figure things out. We were like figure things out, then raise the money. Yeah, I wish there were more of that.
And I think to some extent, it is easier and cheaper today than it ever has been before to figure things out before you raise
Totally.
money.
Yeah, totally.
So, but now there's a, a flood of conflicting advice on how to go do that, and everybody knows everything about everything going on in the startup ecosystem, and now it's a matter of cutting through and finding signal through the noise. Well, Amanda, first of all, congratulations on the business that you've built,
Thank you.
and it's been really enjoyable to watch from afar. I appreciate the time that you have spent, and we will hit you up with a photo of this Christmas's almond cake when we get to it.
I look forward to it. And thank you so much for having me today.
No
Nice
problem. Thanks so much.